The Ningbo massacre of 1542 was a massacre of the Ming dynasty military against the Portuguese settlement in Ningbo. Massacre. After the Portuguese used coercion and bribed their way into obtaining a trade mission in Ningbo, they inflicted savage behavior against the Chinese. In retaliation, in 1545 the entire Portuguese community of Ningbo were exterminated by Chinese forces. The Portuguese began trading in Ningbo around 1522. By 1542, the Portuguese had a sizable community in Ningbo. Portuguese activities from their Ningbo base included pillaging and attacking multiple Chinese port cities around Ningbo for plunder and spoil. They also enslaved people during their raids. The resulting complaints made it to the province's governor, who commanded the settlement destroyed and the inhabitants wiped out. In 1542 the Portuguese settled here by permission and flourished, but their rapacity led to their expulsion in 1545. When a force of 60,000 Chinese troops descended on the community, 800 of the 1,200 Portuguese residents were massacred, and 25 Portuguese vessels and 42 junks were destroyed. The emperor ruled that all Portuguese encountered everywhere should be killed on the spot. The casualties in total, with the 800 dead Portuguese, totaled 12,000 dead Christians. The result of this massacre, in addition to another at Chawanchao, resulted in the Portuguese survivors fleeing to Macau, where they were allowed by China to start a colony. The historian Kenneth Scott Latourette said that the Portuguese had chiefly themselves to thank for the massacres the Chinese committed against them. The Portuguese commander Albuquerque once stated, "A Chinese junkman knew more about courtesy and humanity than a European knights." The Chinese had massacred them after the Portuguese engaged in pillaging and murder in Chinese villages. A lesson was delivered to the Portuguese in this manner from the Chinese. The section of Macau they settled on was San Juan Island. They had to pay rent to China. In 1564, Portugal commanded the trade of India, Japan, and China. Though their pride was deeply shocked at the supreme indifference with which the Chinese treated them, their atrocities at Ningbo and Macau, and their subsequent servility, had opened the eyes of the Celestials to their true character. And unfortunately for other European adventurers, they had come to the conclusion that all Western nations were alike. The Senate of Macau complained to the Viceroy of Goa of the contempt with which the Chinese authorities treated them, confessing however that it was owing more to the Portuguese themselves than to the Chinese. The Chinese were obliged to restrict the commerce of Portugal to the port of Macau. In 1631, The Mirror of Literature, Amusement, and Instruction, Volume 7, Zheqian and Fuqian, Viceroy Yung Cheng created schools out of churches and expelled to Macau Christian missionaries. In a series of anti-Christian measures, he requested that the imperial government enable him to go even further in these actions against Christians, stating they sowed doubt and division among the people, making it question the value of its own customs, condemning Chinese sages and ancestors as demons, and countenancing manners which offended the accepted standards of behavior, the Chinese and foreigners. The position and treaty rights of foreigners in China have hitherto been maintained by military force, and though Mr. Burlingame's mission appears to be especially directed to the abolishment of the force policy, yet without force, that is, a show of military force for protection, the position of foreigners of every class would not be tenable in China. A month. Foreigners have at different periods settled in China, but after remaining for a time, they have been massacred. For instance, Mohammedans and others settled at Canton in the 9th century, and in 889, it is said that 120,000 foreign settlers were massacred. Again in the 16th century, the Portuguese commenced trade and formed a settlement at Ningbo. Spaniards and other foreigners also settled here, but in 1542, the whole settlement, consisting of over 3,000 persons, was destroyed, most of the settlers being put to death. Also at Shapu, about 70 or 80 miles north of Ningbo, on the Hangzhou Bay, there was a settlement of foreigners for the purposes of trade, about 200 years since, who at length were massacred. It is often reported among the people at Ningbo, and other places in China where there are foreigners residing, that they and all the natives connected with them are to be put to death. So rife was such a report at Ningbo 2 years since, and the excitement began to be so great that the foreign consuls requested the native officials to issue proclamations to quiet the people, and threaten punishment to those circulating inflammatory reports.